Welcome, dear YouTubers, dear Flat Earthers, dear Globe Earthers at Plane Analyst. Today we treat something new, no analysis but a story. As you know, in the ancient times among the ancient peoples, the Earth was still flat, and the Sun circled in a more or less vertical arc over the flat Earth. There are perhaps somewhat strange ancient ideas of a sun being pulled by a horse-drawn carriage across the sky or driven by a god, but the model explained the world anyhow, because it was much smaller than today. Any story can be sad, or funny, or thoughtful. It can be true or wrong. And so it is with this story, which happened a long time ago and which I am now telling, the story of the flat Earth. Once upon a time there was a flat Earth around which the sun circled in a vertical arc. One day, however, it happened that a big comet almost touched the Earth. It flew past it at a distance of only 5,000 kilometers, and this comet threw the sun completely out of the way, so that from then on it circled no longer vertically but horizontally in a horizontal path parallel to the Earth's surface. The sun did not set at midnight either, just like it is seen today in the polar regions, as here for example the midnight sun in Norway. At that time, however, it was much higher above the horizon, still at midnight 5,000 kilometers. And the sun was smaller because it was further away. If you want to know at what height it was at the time, you can calculate it as 10 to 20 degrees above the horizon at midnight, depending on latitude and season. We can easily recalculate this by the tangent function, as in this example from the equator, 14 degrees above the horizon. The sun was farther away and therefore smaller. We can calculate that with a Pythagorean theorem. At night, depending on the location, the sun was about a quarter to half the size of noon. It was still pretty bright at night. It never got really dark as it is nowadays. Some people even say that the sun had become a disk after the collision with the comet. If that's true, then the sun became an elongated egg in the evening and then shrank to about a quarter until midnight, but was still brighter than the full moon. Some say the sun was a spotlight with a lampshade then. I do not think that was so, because then it would have been flat in the evening, like a flat ellipse, if you look at it diagonally from the side. But even at those times it was round at any time of the day. Whereas previously at the time of equinox, the sun was always rising right in the east. It now seemed to be at a different angle for everyone, even though it was at the same latitude. This confused the people a lot. You could no longer orientate yourself to the sun. The people were very sad because the romantic sunset was missing now, and the sun was far too small in the evening. The fairy Aurora had a mercy on the people and pumped up the sun every evening to its daily size. And the fairy Chaska lifted the horizon up each evening with her magical power 5,000 kilometers, so that people could experience a real sunset again. Old Master Samuel Robotham was the founder of the religion and the chief ideologue, and his dogmas were strictly adhered to. One dogma, for example, was that the horizon would always rise to the eye level. The inhabitants enjoyed to look at the horizon and were happy about the dogma, but they never calculated how much degrees the horizon could ascend. They never made accurate measurements, which was strictly prohibited on punishment. At that time, very confused ideas prevailed about mathematics, geometry and perspective. A dogma of the chief ideologist Robotham was that the feet of a person or the wheels of a train would disappear the farther they moved. Eric was the leading opinion maker and successfully spread dogmas of Robotham among the people. He did this so skillfully that no one noticed how he simply shifted the geometric line to the vanishing point. We know today that perspective is the image as seen from a very specific point of view. Here I see the farmhouse diagonally from the side and the white hut is diagonally behind. If I go 10 meters further to the left, then the white hut almost sticks to the house. If I go further 5 meters, then the white hut behind the house has disappeared. Only if you change your own point of view, then the perspective can change. However, the inhabitants of that time believed that the simple use of a telescope alone could change the perspective. Nowadays we have very powerful telescopes and cameras with zoom lenses that can be used to pick up distant objects. This means that they are exactly scaled up to a bigger scale. Of course, the objects we observe cannot change their shape and their relative position to each other, unless we change our point of view. Well, that was a bit different at those times, for Old Master Robotham developed together with the great magician Dumbledore the magical telescope. They used an effective magic spell that is still kept secret until today. This telescope had a magic key. With this one could change the positional relationship of the observed objects. For example, you could lift ships again that had already disappeared halfway across the horizon. Previously, the flat earth of ancient peoples had one single sky, but now the world had grown bigger, and there was the southern sky and the northern sky, and the inhabitants north of the equator wanted to see the polar star and the northern constellations, and the inhabitants south of the equator the southern starry sky. The fairy Estrella solved the problem with a big magic mirror, and every time someone looked into the sky north of the equator, she turned the mirror north, and if someone looked to the sky in the south, to the south. Oh my God, she had a lot to do there! The fairies Cassandra and Morgana helped her. Nevertheless, there was always a lot of trouble with the fairy trade union. At that time it was also strictly forbidden to worry about why an apple fell to the ground and how the gravitational force works. The gravity was simply ignored.
In time-lapse, we see the suspended ball approach the concrete block and come to rest. Obviously, therefore, the large mass of the concrete block causes a force on the ball, which we call gravity.
Well, I admit at those ancient times obviously concrete blocks did not yet exist. At that time it was also believed that due to a magical property, water automatically always spreads out flat. At that time the world had already been measured and mapped, but at first it was drawn to a sphere. Chief geographer Alex Gleason made a map of it by unrolling the ball to all directions starting from the North Pole. Therefore, the further you moved away from the North Pole, the more distorted the map was. Especially in the southern hemisphere, the distortions were particularly strong. South Africa became unnaturally broad the farther south one came, and it was similar to South America. The further south, the broader and more unnatural it became. But the biggest problem was Australia. At that time it was already known that it reached out 3,860 kilometers in north-south direction and roughly the same distance in east-west direction, namely 4,000 kilometers. And on the new map it all was wrong. since all distances in east-west direction were stretched by about 2.5 times. The distances indicated on the signs were no longer true. Although everyone knew approximately how far it is to the next city, this did not match the new map. It was suggested to simply shrink Australia on the Gleason map again, but that did not work because Australia already then essentially had 3 different time zones. In the east, the sun rose at the same time as in the Japanese island of Minamitori, and in the west it did not rise until 2.5 hours later as in the Chinese city of Macau. The Gleason map was, however, rigorously constructed in a way that their longitudes were related to cities with equal sunrise times. And if you would just shrink Australia, then the longitudes and sunrise times, the basic principles of this map, would not be saved. Even all fairies and wizards did not know what to do and could not help. Until one day Ekrikon the sage made an ingenious proposal. He just removed all the distance informations from the signposts and made the signs colorful instead. There is still much to be told about this mysterious world, such as the evil wizard who repeatedly angered people. But every story has an end, so does this story too. And the video should not be too long either. The fairies and the wizards no longer exist today, and the flat world has become spherical. Only a few of the inhabitants of that time still live in our midst today, and they all lived happily ever after. I fitted into this story some aspects of the flat earth belief system or world view in the shape of a fairy tale. I highlighted the problems of the system and showed possible solutions. If these solutions seem a bit strange to you, it's probably because there are no working solutions. I was inspired by the eponymous video from Eric Dubay and by this maudlin but meaningless fairy tale of Cassandra in German language on this subject. If it gave you the impression that the theory of the flat earth is a fairy tale, then this is just in the nature of things, because there are far too many blatant contradictions with reality. For the sake of completeness, I point out once again that I have no connection to NASA or other space agencies, astronomy societies, public education institutes, and state governments. I have no prejudice against Jesuits, Freemasons, or Jews, and do not belong to one of these communities. On the subject of flat earth, there will be soon some more videos of me that will focus on historical aspects, on the horizon line and on perspective. And here it will go right to the point. If you like this video, then my next videos will definitely please you. Just look at it. I thank you for watching and listening, and see you soon.